Karla Monroe always arrived before revel. By 04:45, she was already crossing the concrete service pad outside Hangar B, the hem of her gray maintenance jacket brushing against dew-soaked gravel. She walked like someone who belonged but never stayed long enough to prove it, holding a tool case in one hand and a coffee thermos in the other. The same quiet rhythm every day. No one saluted her. No one had to. Karla wasn't military. She wore no insignia, had no rank, and the most official thing on her was the laminated badge clipped to her. Belt civilian contractor, avionics support. Some called her the ghost tech. Others joked she was a base commander's niece or a favor hire who never left. When cadets didn't recognize her, they assumed she worked janitorial rotation and often left her doors unopened, until she keyed them herself. She never corrected them. The way she saw it, silence was cheaper than pride. Besides, the real pilots didn't notice her. Not when they were too busy posturing for instructors or arguing over fuel. Trim settings? At best, she was background noise. A helpful shadow who ran diagnostics on T6 Texan IIs while they laughed and quoted Top Gun lines in the ready room. Karla didn't laugh with them. She knew the plane better than they knew each other. She knew which seat had a loose harness bracket, which HUD flickered under voltage shift, and which throttle quadrant had been reset too many times without recalibration. But none of that mattered when she wasn't on the flight schedule, didn't wear a flight suit, and had no wings stitched into her chest. She moved through the rows of aircraft like a librarian tracing the spines of old books. Each tail number told her a story, some good, some worrying. One of them had a high-frequency pitch distortion she couldn't place yet. Another had a switch delay in the landing gear relay that wasn't in the fault. Logs. She wrote those notes down anyway. No one asked her to. No one would read them. Inside the hangar office, the air always smelled of coffee and sweat. Cadets lounged in flight suits, boots on tables, laughing too loud, while instructors tapped their clipboards and pretended not to hear. Karla stepped in quietly, pulled schematics from the printer, and walked out just as quiet. A few of them looked up long enough to smirk. One leaned toward another and whispered, loud enough for her to hear, that she probably still thought a Cessna 172 could win a dogfight. She kept walking. At the far end of the tarmac, a junior officer flagged her down to double-check a data uplink in an instructor's T6. She nodded, slid into the rear seat, and ran a series of tests without asking for instructions. The HUD flickered, then settled. She jotted one line on the checklist, unplugged the diagnostics tablet, and handed it back without fanfare. The lieutenant didn't thank her. He was already on his headset, halfway through a complaint about fuel pressure lag that Karla had corrected. 5 minutes earlier, it wasn't bitterness she carried. It was something slower, heavier, like dust settling after rotors lift. Every day she stood beside machines capable of vertical climbs and stall spins. And every day she was told in quiet ways that she wasn't one of them. Not anymore. There had been a time, but time doesn't count when no one believes you flew in the first place. Not when your name is scrubbed from flight rosters and replaced by euphemisms, like reassigned or transitioned to support roles. She didn't argue. The sky didn't owe her anything. She still walked it, just closer to the ground now. And still, every morning, she ran her hand along the edge of one particular tail fin. It had a small nick on the rudder, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. Karla always found it by touch, not because it mattered, but because remembering where that scar came from reminded her she hadn't imagined it all. The cadets never noticed. To them, she was a quiet woman with calloused fingers and no story worth telling. Just someone who showed up on time, spoke rarely, and disappeared before lunch. They didn't know the sky had once answered her voice. They didn't know she still dreamed in stall warnings and angle of attack tones. They didn't know her at all. But they would. By 05:10, the wind had already shifted. It came in hard from the southeast, thick with salt and a smell that signaled the Gulf was about to wake angry. Clouds stacked low and heavy over the Texas flight line, bruised at the edges with flashes that didn't crack but rolled, slow and mean. The tarmac glistened with a film of condensation that hadn't come from rain, yet just air pulled too close to boiling. Inside the operations shack, Major Denton stared at the weather radar and didn't blink. The screen showed a level 2 squall forming 60 miles offshore, with outliers brushing closer. He glanced once at the printed memo from Base Command demonstration flight. Eyes from Randolph and Langley observing via live relay. No delays authorized. The order wasn't surprising. Political optics didn't care about gust thresholds or microbursts. It was a priority demo, part of a performance review tied to funding for the next fiscal year. 2 T6 Texan IIs were scheduled to fly a low-altitude intercept drill against drone targets. One was instructor-piloted. The other carried a cadet doing their first graded solo under real-time monitoring. Karla Monroe had been on the flight line since 0435. She wore her badge low and her sleeves rolled halfway to her forearms. A digital multimeter hung from her belt, still warm from last use. She stopped beside the second aircraft in the row. Tail number 7883. Cadet Mason's bird. She climbed up the ladder, lifted the canopy hatch, and powered on the secondary systems for a quick avionics pass. The HUD blinked, then steadied. The airspeed tape stuttered before it locked in. She pressed 2 fingers lightly against the side panel near the flight. Computer housing. A subtle vibration echoed through her skin off frequency, almost like a buffer delay loop or corrupted read timing. She reran the test. Same result. The phase chip tied to the navigation system wasn't processing angular changes consistently. It was a rare error, one Karla had only seen twice in 10 years. Under normal load, the pilot might not notice until entering a rapid bank or vertical climb. But under wind shear, she flagged the fault code, labeled the urgency as priority, and logged it through the maintenance tablet. By 0548, her entry was in the system. By 0551, it was flagged for review. At 0612, she stopped the operations NCO outside the hangar, handed him a printout, and explained the delay loop. He nodded, thanked her, and said he'd pass it up. His voice was polite. His eyes had already shifted behind her. At 0617, a technician from the instructor's crew ran diagnostics on the same aircraft. He cleared it in under 6 minutes. When Karla checked the log, her entry had been reclassified to monitor only no follow-up action. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't call the tower or demand reinspection. She simply walked back to her truck, opened her laptop, and began simulating the drift values the chip might produce if the pilot tried to counter yaw mid-climb. Outside, the wind pushed again. Flags stiffened. Windsocks bent sideways and held there. At 0635, the command tower issued final clearance for launch. One of the crew chiefs joked that the wind was perfect for stress testing the cadets' confidence. Karla didn't joke. She looked out across the flight line, watched a tech adjust a pitot cover, and waited for the moment she knew would come. She couldn't say how. But when you spend enough time listening to engines breathe and air move across fuselages, you learn to hear tension long before the noise starts. And the air was loud now, even in silence. At 0658, Karla Monroe crossed the tarmac like she always did, steady, invisible. The T6 Texan II designated for the demo sat with its canopy open, fuel line detached, avionics in standby. The wind kept pressing, but no one called for delay. Final checks were wrapping up, and cadets milled nearby, half in uniform, half in anticipation. Karla didn't speak. She climbed the ladder to the cockpit with practiced ease, her boots finding the rungs without hesitation. The gesture was so casual, so ordinary, that it took a few seconds before anyone realized she wasn't just inspecting a panel. She slid into the seat and reached for the harness. A chuckle broke the silence. Then another. One of the cadets elbowed his buddy and said she was probably just checking for smudges. Someone else muttered that she'd finally snapped. A few laughed. No one moved to stop her. She was the tech lady, after all. She didn't matter, but she strapped in, not just buckled. She adjusted shoulder harnesses with precision, twisted her body to test restriction, set her feet against the rudder pedals. Her hands moved like someone returning home, not sneaking into a place they didn't belong. Then she flipped the master switch. Avionics systems came alive in a smooth surge. HUD powered on. Radios crackled low, waiting for connection. The onboard battery kicked into full draw, and flight systems lit across both front and back seats. The laughter faded. Voices dropped. Inside operations, a junior controller leaned toward the mic and asked for identification. Karla didn't respond immediately. She reached forward, adjusted the intercom channel, and pressed the PTT switch with the edge of her glove. Then she spoke one word. Clear. Soft. Intelligible. Vigil 7. The controller froze. His headset went silent. A second voice in the ops room whispered the phrase again, like he wasn't sure he heard it right. Vigil 7. The supervisor walked over, looked at the screen, and asked who authorized the code use. No one answered. The hangar speakers didn't echo her words. The channel was too narrow for public relay. But inside command, the shift was instant. A red icon blinked on a secured console that hadn't lit in 8 years. The code was buried, locked, and attached to only one archived protocol, one that had been deactivated after a fatal crash and never reissued. On the tarmac, Karla waited, not like someone caught in the act, like someone waiting to be cleared. Her fingers hovered over the rest of the startup sequence. Her eyes stayed level, She didn't look at the cadets below, didn't acknowledge the confusion rising behind her. She was already in the cockpit, already ready, and no one had ever seen her like that before. Not uniformed, not requested. Just calm and seated in a war machine with her name nowhere on the flight. Schedule in the base's oldest ghost protocol ringing silently through the comms. It wasn't a prank. Not anymore. At 0701 the call came through. Abort cockpit activity. Unauthorized personnel in aircraft 7883. The voice from operations was clipped, firm. Karla heard it through the monitor relay in her helmet, but she didn't flinch. She kept the avionics on standby, hands still hovering just above the throttle and flight display. In the background, a second voice barked for the tech on duty to cut the external power supply. Then the radar pinged. At first, it was one blip, then three, all low-altitude signatures skimming just beneath standard drone altitude. Masked by training mode filters, a software technician inside operations blinked, froze, and switched to manual overlay. The system reclassified the signals. UAVs. Not simulation, not ours. By 0703, a single phrase echoed inside the control tower. This isn't training. The radar operator shouted over her shoulder that the inbound drones weren't on any Blue Force list. Speed 280 knots. Direction southeast vector. Distance under 15 miles and closing fast. Flight line officers rushed to confirm all assets were still grounded. They were, except one. Karla was already spooled up. Battery on, comms hot. Navigation green. Her finger hovered over the engine start switch like it had always belonged. There. Command called again. Louder. Get her out of that seat. Now. But no one moved. Major Denton stood behind the glass, headset pressed tight. His voice had dropped 2 octaves. Who else is in the air? The answer came fast. No one. Another second passed. Then who's ready? Eyes turned to the tarmac. Karla's hands moved before anyone gave her the go. She flipped the ignition. Starter engaged. Prop spun to life with a metallic whine that rose into steady roar. Fuel flow adjusted. Oxygen check confirmed. She toggled through checklists in her mind without looking down. The comms went quiet. No one told her to stop again. By 0705, the base's entire defense posture had shifted. The demo was scrapped. The airspace was live. And the only bird with systems hot and a pilot already strapped in wasn't listed on any flight manifest. She didn't have authorization, but she had the stick. And now, she had the sky. At 0707, Karla eased the throttle forward. The T6 Texan II lurched, nose twitching against a crosswind that had picked up over the last 10 minutes. Wind shear metrics hadn't updated, but she felt it through the control stick. Her right hand held the yoke with just enough tension to keep the line true. Her left tracked engine RPM like a pulse. The prop screamed as the nose wheel lifted slightly. Not enough to rotate, just to taste the lift. Rain began to scatter across the canopy. She kept her eyes forward, scanning runway markers while mentally tracking the drone pings in her periphery. They were closing in fast, but not close enough to force a change in vector. Not yet. The tower still hadn't given formal clearance. She didn't ask again. The aircraft was alive, systems synced. She knew this feel. Not from manuals or simulators, from years ago. From places where ground fire snapped at the belly of an A-10 and the smell of hydraulic fluid meant you had 15 seconds to stabilize or not. She adjusted rudder trim. The jet's balance felt heavy left. She shifted weight with a slight heel tap. The aircraft aligned. At 0709, the main wheels kissed loose gravel left over from a missed sweep. She noted it, logged the traction loss, compensated with pitch adjustment, 1/2 inch. Then she throttled to full. The aircraft howled as it surged forward, her back pressed into the seat cushion. She glanced once at the HUD, speed climbing, wind slamming into the frame. Every vibration meant something. Slight flutter on the canopy, pressure unbalanced along the left wing root. She dialed in 2 clicks of aileron correction. Smooth now. At 87 knots, she called rotation. Her voice didn't tremble. The stick eased back, the nose lifted. For a heartbeat, the tires still brushed the runway. Friction, arguing with physics. Then they lost contact. Air took over. She was flying. The storm above hadn't cleared. Visibility hovered at marginal. The ceiling was low, cloud base near 1,800 feet. But she wasn't climbing to cruise. Not yet. She held tight just above the threshold, low enough to stay beneath radar glare, high enough to maneuver if one of the drones changed course. Inside the cockpit, the T6 groaned like a beast shaking off rust. But she coaxed it forward with such precision it felt like a dance already. Choreographed, her hands never stopped. Trim, scan, stabilize. Breath. The headset crackled. Someone tried calling her back. She didn't answer. A flash, not lightning, not glare, just a memory. A canyon wall, a burnt wingtip, a ground controller yelling coordinates that didn't match terrain. She remembered the warning tone right before the A-10 spun out. She remembered the smoke, the final call that never made it into the report. Now she was here again, back in the air, not on a schedule, not on a mission, just answering a question no one thought to ask. Could she still fly? She didn't have to answer. The sky already knew. At 0711, Karla banked southeast, skimming just below the broken cloud layer. The drones were still shadowed by storm clutter, but the threat display marked their positions, staggered triangle formation. 2 ahead, 1 trailing, all flying low with intermittent jamming pulses. She toggled her transponder to shadow mode, giving them just enough radar signature to spot her. The move worked. 1 drone veered west, shifting to intercept. Karla dipped her altitude to 900 feet and banked hard right, pulling 2. 5 Gs and bleeding speed to drag the drone's approach path directly into the engagement envelope of the base's southern SAM battery. The radar crew picked up the drone the moment it committed. A fire-and-forget Stinger launcher auto-tracked from the perimeter wall. Karla counted beats. 1, 2, then impact. A ball of flame bloomed mid-air, the shockwave trailing behind like a slow echo. The tower didn't respond at first. No one moved. Then someone in command finally shouted, "That was live." Karla already knew. The detonation pattern, the heat bloom, even the way the shrapnel dispersed. This wasn't a sim. These weren't training dummies. Someone had slipped real hostiles into a scheduled exercise. Her gut had been right since the first radar glitch. At 0713, the remaining drones split. 1 broke off and dove low. The other arced up, accelerating. Karla pushed throttle and shifted pitch. She climbed just enough to reposition, forcing the second drone to recalculate trajectory. She didn't have weapons. No missiles, no active kill switch. All she had was knowledge of the base's radar geometry and how drones hunted. She swung wide, presenting herself as a slow-moving lure. The drone locked on. Base command tried to warn her, but she'd already committed. She feathered the throttle, pretended to stall, and gave just enough flare to mimic a climb. The drone moved in. Just as it crossed the kill zone, she dropped flaps, yanked left rudder, and popped smoke from the tail. A second SAM fired. This one didn't miss either. Karla didn't cheer. She turned the aircraft, rolled level, and scanned for more threats. Her hands never left the controls. Protocol had no answers for this. But she did. At Aero 738, while recovery crews assessed the drone wreckage and Karla brought the T-6 back down into a maintenance taxi loop, Command wasn't watching the sky. They were digging into files most of them had never seen before. Lieutenant Commander Mahoney had heard the phrase once. Vigil 7. It wasn't standard, wasn't in any open doctrine, but the reaction it triggered in the system told him it used to mean something. In a secured briefing room, 3 officers stared at a classified training archive from 2015. The footage was grainy. A-10 Thunderbolt II, training flight gone wrong. Instructor Major Wes Fields, recorded failure in both hydraulic lines. Crash in a low canyon outside Laughlin Air Force Base, fatal. Single occupant listed. No flight student on record. No mention of secondary crew. But the comms log held something strange. A second voice, faint, female, calm, calling out pitch values during descent. No one had ever followed up. The code phrase Karla used was linked to Fields. It was his override. His informal protocol used only in cockpit emergencies when the flight envelope broke beyond SOP. Something you used when muscle memory had to replace doctrine. Something you passed down only to people who'd flown with you. By 0803, someone finally asked the right question. Who was working with Fields that day? There was no listed co-pilot. But one of the names attached to the A-10's ground readiness crew included a contractor technician Monroe, Karla R. Further queries turned up a non-disclosure agreement signed 4 days after. The crash. Her signature. Classification level 4. Reason undisclosed crew manifest conflict. The room went still. Major Fields had been a decorated instructor. They'd buried him with honors. Praised his solo effort to guide the damaged aircraft away from civilian ground structures. But if Karla had been on board, it wasn't solo. If she'd guided the aircraft down when Fields blacked out, as the new log suggested, then her silence had protected more than his legacy. It had protected the Air Force. At 0811, Colonel Denton stepped into the operations room and closed the door. His face looked older than it had 2 hours earlier. He held a tablet with full comms overlay from Karla's sortie. He'd reviewed her intercept arc, her altitude change against radar profiles, the lure path she created for the drone. and the final split-second roll that guided its lock into SAM range. A maneuver Fields once sketched during training seminars but never saw. Executed. Until now, she hadn't guessed her way through that sortie. She'd flown it from memory, from training buried under silence. At 08:20, Karla stood outside the debriefing trailer, still in her flight harness. Her gloves were off, fingers marked with oil and pressure lines. She didn't ask if she was in trouble. She just waited. Denton opened the door and nodded her inside. No salute, no scolding, just motion. She stepped in. The screen lit up with flight telemetry. Her flight. The room was quiet. He didn't ask why she flew. He asked where she learned that maneuver. She met his eyes. Steady. Major Fields, she said. Denton exhaled slowly. You were in that jet, weren't you? Yes. Sir. They told us he was alone. I wasn't on the manifest. Why, they said I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't rated. I was filling in. The WSO called out sick. It was a local pattern run. They said it was easier to clean up the report than explain why I survived. Denton nodded once. Jaw tight. You've been grounded ever since. She didn't answer. He looked at her hands, still flexing out the flight memory. You saved the aircraft. He died, she said, and you didn't. I did what I was told after. No. Today you did what no one could. The silence stretched between them like something sacred. Then he turned the screen, showed her the path her T-6 had drawn through hostile airspace. This is real doctrine now, and they can't ignore it anymore. Her shoulders dropped just slightly, not in defeat, but in weight leaving. After 8 years, the silence had spoken, and everyone finally heard. By 10:15, the footage from Karla Monroe's flight had already reached Randolph. At 13:30, it was streaming in an internal Joint Tactical Applications meeting attended by 2 generals, 1 contractor from DARPA, and a doctrine officer from Langley who hadn't blinked once in 20 minutes. The video played from the top, no cuts, from engine start to drone explosion, from unauthorized takeoff to textbook intercept. They didn't ask how she got in the cockpit. They asked how she knew where the drones would commit, how she anticipated the jamming ripple, why she feathered the left rudder 2 seconds before the radar flash. The answers were on screen. Her instincts were recorded in real time. By 16:05, an internal memo was circulated. Subject Tactical Response Deviation 7. Proposal evaluate live intercept viability from low-prop trainer aircraft. Under gray zone threat protocols, reference Monroe incident. It didn't use the word heroic. It didn't mention the erased years, the code phrase, or the fact that until this morning, Monroe had been considered a civilian contractor with limited flight clearance. What it did say was that her trajectory, her choice to bait and divert the drones into the SAM field, presented a maneuver that was both executable and repeatable under certain conditions. That last phrase would become the hedge, but it wouldn't stop the rewrite. By the end of the week, her telemetry path had been imported into 4 simulation systems. 1 at Edwards, 1 at Eglin, 1 at Maxwell, and 1 inside a secure USAF training sandbox with no base name attached. The maneuver was labeled Monroe Intercept Arc. Instructors called it MIA for short. Cadets struggled to land it on their first dozen tries. One of them asked where it came from. His instructor said, quietly, a woman who shouldn't have had to prove it. Karla didn't speak at any of the reviews. She was invited to sit in, offered a side chair in 2 virtual sessions. She brought no slides, no bullet points. She answered questions in short sentences. She didn't editorialize. When someone from Pentagon Ops asked why she never submitted a pilot's safety brief after the Fields crash, she said simply, I wasn't asked. By the end of the month, the maneuver had its own section in the revised SOP under Rapid Manual, Intercept in Mixed Signal Airspace. It was taught as a case study for thinking outside automation under real-time, tactical ambiguity. Her name appeared once at the bottom of the summary in parenthesis. Monroe, K, R. She never asked for more. Back on base. Her clearance badge changed color. One day it was yellow. The next it was blue. The shift happened without announcement. No ceremony. But when she walked past the flight line that morning, one of the cadets who once laughed at her stood and said softly, Ma'am. She nodded. Said nothing. Instructors began calling her for feedback on pattern integrity, wind correction at low altitude, visual processing under masked threat profiles. Her answers were always short, always field-tested. When her name appeared on the distribution list for the tactical integration team, no one questioned it. Not anymore. Because now, they had proof, not of what she could do, but of what she'd already done. And they were building the future around it. It was 22:17 when Karla stepped back onto the flight line. The tarmac was quiet now, shadows stretching long under perimeter lights. The kind of hush only an airbase knows after everything flies, lands, and rests. The same T-6 Texan II sat parked beneath hangar lights, its canopy sealed, fuselage cleaned, panels secured. A new tail number had been stenciled on, but she recognized the scrape on the left side of the forward gear door. She'd patched that herself. Her boots moved slow across the concrete. She didn't rush. Her hands stayed tucked into her jacket, fingers tapping gently at the seams. It had been months since the flight, long enough for command to settle into the new doctrine, long enough for her name to appear in a manual, not in bold, not in praise, just present. And that was enough. A young technician stepped out from the hangar shadows, clipboard tucked under one arm. He looked up quickly, surprised. "Ma'am, you need access." Karla shook her head once. "Just saying goodnight." He nodded and stepped back, said nothing else. There was no awkward pause, no sideways glance, no trace of the smirks that used to follow her walk across this space. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It was respect, resting in place. As she moved past the row of aircraft, two cadets stepped aside instinctively. One gave a subtle nod. The other, unprompted, raised a quick salute. She didn't return it, didn't need to. They dropped their hands a beat later, watching her continue into the dark. She stopped beside the final aircraft, placed her hand lightly on the cowling, just above the edge where the engine heat still lingered from an earlier test. Cycle. The metal was warm, alive, almost. She smiled. Just enough for herself. In her mind, she heard it again the moment her wheels left the runway. The wind dragging across the fuselage, the voice in her headset trying to stop her, and the voice in her chest saying, "Keep going." That moment hadn't left. It never would. She remembered the dive, the pull, the evasive split that sent the drone spiraling into a SAM arc. She remembered the aftershock and the way the stick had vibrated in her hands. Not from failure, but release. The flight hadn't been clean, but it had been true. No one gave her a medal. She didn't ask for one. No ceremony followed. No general shook her hand. There was no plaque on the hangar wall, no banner with her name. Only a maneuver and a doctrine. And the slow realization across command that sometimes what doesn't fit the manual writes the next one. She turned back toward the base. The stars were low, scattered behind a thin ceiling of cirrus that didn't threaten anything. Her boots moved without sound. And this time, no one questioned where she was going, or why. As she crossed the line, one voice from the shadows called out gently, "See you tomorrow, ma'am." She didn't reply, but the echo stayed with her, soft as turbine idle. This was her place now, not as a symbol, not even as a legend, just as someone who flew when it counted. And no one could erase that again.